The latest report by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released on the 9th of August, made it unequivocally clear. We're not even close to being on track to meeting the goals laid out by the Paris Agreement back at COP21 in December 2015. And that's despite 197 countries having signed this clear map for transitioning to sustainable development. So the question is, why? The evidence for the link between human action and climate change is undeniable. The impact of our broken world increasingly tangible in the form of floods, wildfires, droughts, and indeed pandemics. Public outcries for greater action are widespread, from Fridays for Future through Extinction Rebellion, and policy commitments with a climate change mitigation focus are ever more abundant. And yet the needle hasn't really shifted. We have the technological and economic means to solve these things. So what's the root cause of the crisis in global climate leadership? And what will it take to change things? I'm here with environmentalist Tom Burke, who's the co-founder and chairman of climate change think tank E3G, to explore these questions a bit further. Tom's thesis is simple. The problem is climate politics, or rather the lack of understanding into what this is, how it differs from climate policy, and how it can be leveraged for change. So Tom, it's a pleasure to have you here as part of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, and perhaps a context-setting question to start with. In the context of climate change, what's the difference between politics and policy?
Policy is a map. It's a route map. It tells you how to get from here to there. And there are many different routes, and you can examine them all and try and figure out which ones are the best routes. And use quite sophisticated tools to make a map. And then you have to decide which, or maybe on several, to use several of those routes. Politics is the journey. It's how you get you and everybody who has to come with you from here to there. And you use a completely different set of tools to make the journey. You use, like you do in any journey, you use boots and ropes and rucksacks and ice axes, and you quite often have to use them on the people who've got to bring along on the journey. And that's the difference. And so you don't necessarily change the politics very much by being like Colonel Blimp and repeating your advice to the natives in an ever louder voice because they haven't understood you. You've really got to understand what are the difficulties of the journey, which are not the same as the difficulties on the map. And it's that difference in discourse that I think is one of the main reasons why we're not moving fast enough. We simply don't understand the political problems as well as we understand the technological and economic problems.
Absolutely. So as I've understood it, one of the key problems then is that when we talk about politics, a lot of the time actually the discourse that these politicians are using isn't really political discourse at all. It's rather policy discourse in a different guise. So what needs to change in the role that politicians and public administrators are playing to ensure governments are effective?
Well, in a sense, we often forget that there are two bits to government. There's an administrative bit of government and there's a political bit of government. Now, the policy discussion is what the administrative bit of government deals with and is quite good at, much better. Most of the failures are failures in the political bit of government. They're failure literally of politicians to ask the administrative bit of government to do the things that are necessary and to do them fast enough and to solve the problems of doing them fast enough. And that's because, politics is about interests, and it's about battles between both a worldview and a reflection of those interests that support that worldview. So, for instance, there's an argument, a political argument, is the difference between people's freedom to burn all the fossil fuels they want as distinct from the freedom of the rest of us not to find ourselves in a climate we can't live with. Now, the people who interests that want freedom to be the dominant aspect of the political discourse are the fossil fuel lobbies of all sorts, the bankers who make money out of simply problems when they arise and when they're solved, and the people who want put an emphasis on freedom from are all the people who will really be hurt if climate policy fails. And I don't think we're organizing coalitions around each of those different interests very effectively in terms of gaining power. So what you have now is a situation where the fossil fuel interests and freedom too are very much dominant in their access to power, and the people who've got a bigger interest in freedom from, especially young people, have relatively little access to power. And that really means you limit the amount that the administrative bit of government can do.
Yeah, so I guess then this problem, and you touched on it already, has a lot to do with language. The language that gets used, how you're framing either problems or opportunities. And if I think about the language that usually gets used around the climate crisis and what we need to solve, a lot is framed by facts. And obviously that's necessary. Grounding arguments that we're making in science is vital. But why don't facts alone get through to people as we need?
Well, the facts do get through in the policy realm, but they don't necessarily mean all that much in the political realm. Most people don't spend very much of their lives dealing with facts as part of their professional activity. They deal with the facts that are relevant to their jobs. They deal with the facts that are relevant to their lives, but they don't spend a lot of their life trying to work out what the facts are in an issue that seems remote, like climate change. So they lack confidence in their ability to last that, and they, in a sense, are not moved by the facts. They're moved by what people they know say to them. They're moved, in a sense, by who they trust. And so what's lacking in the sort of political realm is people don't know who to trust on climate change. And they're not getting very much of a lead, and a consistent and coherent lead, from political leaders. And that's true whether you're living in a democracy or whether you're living in an autocratic or authoritarian regime. The leaders simply aren't offering up a kind of compelling narrative that people believe and trust as a reason for doing things. Now, what we saw with the virus was very interesting. We saw that when people understood what needed to be done, they were very willing to do that. And that was a surprise to a lot of people in government who thought that somehow people's patience with what needed to be done would run out and they wouldn't do it for very long. Turned out to be completely the different, exact opposite, that politicians wanted to give up doing things, and the public felt uneasy enough and to argue with the politicians, you should go on doing things. And so that question of trust is central to creating the sort of political momentum for change. And without that political momentum, it doesn't matter how good your policy analysis is, how good how accurate the facts are, they simply don't get used.
Absolutely. And you've touched on this idea of trust, which in terms of reinforcing or strengthening our democracies is incredibly important, of course. I know, Tom, that you've written and spoken a lot before about the psychological dimensions of trust. So how you build it, how you break it down. And I wondered if you could possibly share some of these thoughts.
Well, the piece about that relates again back to the idea of political discourse. But we're primates. What really makes us successful is that we, by and large, we don't only cooperate with each other, we also compete with each other. We're not going to solve climate change without competition that drives innovation. We absolutely need that. But if that competition is not inside an envelope of cooperation, then it won't get you anywhere. It will actually end up in people fighting each other instead of working together. And what's the core to cooperation is trust. You cooperate with people you trust. And in a sense, that's why humanity's done so well, because we've, by and large, over lots of ups and downs, managed to keep our competitive instincts inside that envelope of cooperation. And the institutions we've built up are like repositories for that trust. They're where we bank the experience we have, the benefits of cooperation exceeding competition. Well, what we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years is a really very dynamic drive to get competition to get outside that boundary of cooperation. And so it's not just a problem for climate change, it's a problem for a whole range of other issues as well, is that we simply are not investing enough in building up the institutions that maintain that bank of trust we need in order to cooperate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And so the next thought I have here is, in terms of these global institutions, so the existing ones that we have, maybe together with the rules and regulation systems that sit behind them, they're increasingly under stress in these periods of crisis. And of course, in this case, we're talking about the climate crisis, but they obviously take many other forms as well. So what do we need to do to maintain these institutions, or indeed to develop them further?
I think we need political leaders who understand the value of them. The reason we built the UN system, the reason we even built the EU, was because people really did not want to repeat the experience of the first half of the 20th century, which was a pretty unpleasant experience for everybody all over the world. We can't afford to do that with climate change. Now, those institutions, in a sense, a typical piece of history we tend to forget. We tend to forget or lose the memory of those things. And what actually holds us together and keeps that memory alive is political leadership. Political leaders are what keep you investing in those institutions. And frankly, we've had a diminution, a very considerable diminution in the quality of political leadership. And partly that's because, again, that tremendously, we're still organizing, at least in Britain and actually much of Europe and the West, our politics around a left-right axis, which has collapsed as a axis of choice. And we need really now to start thinking much more of an axis of choice, which is about between those people who want to keep things as they are now and those people who really understand that if we don't build a better future, the climate will shape the future for us and we won't like it. So we have to have a different axis of choice in politics, and that will throw up different kinds of leaders.
So on a practical level then, if we're looking to establish this new axis of choice, does that just mean that existing political parties need to change what they're saying? So change their rhetoric from, to take the UK as an example, Labour focusing just on the typical left, if we're thinking within that binary, and Conservatives on the right? Or is it about building new structures that enable new types of coalitions? Is it just about the rhetoric? What do you think's needed there?
Well, I wish I had an easy answer to that question. I think the point about representative democracy, let me put it in context. The reason that we need democracy in order to deal with climate change is because despots, in order to stay in power, have to destroy all of the machinery we've built up to learn from our mistakes. Independent judiciary, free press, all of those sort of institutions that are features of democracy all have to be destroyed. There is no mistake-free way to a safe climate. And one of the key pieces of that thing that underpins it, you can't have democracy without the rule of law. And so what you see with authoritarians, by the way, is they tend to destroy the rule of law. And you can't have the rule of law, as we've seen very recently, without social cohesion. So you really do need to have, as a background to this, to bear in mind that you've got to have, in a sense, at least a society that can learn from its mistakes and has some of those features. Now that the coalition that built left-right, the coalitions that supported the left and right, in a sense, have collapsed. Then a lot we've more or less understood you have to have a mixture of both the state and markets in order to deliver prosperity and security. So we need a new axis of choice. And that's really, as I say, about whether we build a future we can live with, or we try to hang on to the present and get defeated by a changing climate. And in a sense, you build that from the bottom up. You can't impose that from the top down. And the bit that gives me most hope, in a sense, is I see all the stuff that doesn't get reported very much in the newspapers and in the media around the world, where people are just getting together in their communities to do something that whatever they can do about climate change. And I think it's building out of that base and understanding that basically climate change is solving climate change, they're trying to drive it to build a different kind of politics, which means we can make better use of the administrative machinery we've got that already works quite well, by the way. And that in how do you do that? I honestly don't know. But you start by saying to people, can you help with whatever
Absolutely.
that people do? You asking people to help you to do something it's an enormous reflex. And again, we've seen it in the virus, but we've just seen it again in Afghanistan. When people are asked to help, whatever their culture, wherever they are, there's a tremendous reflex to respond to that. So we need to start very much in the bottom up, I think, asking people to help us deal with the problem in practical ways. Now, that means not asking people to say something different or think something different, but asking them to do something different. And I think that important piece, people are much more confident of what they've done and the experience they've had than they are with the facts, to go back to your earlier question.
Absolutely. I mean, if I think about some of the initiatives that I'm personally most inspired by at the moment in terms of, community empowerment, it's those like donut economics in action, participatory city, 15-minute cities, or even 1-minute city, ideas that people at a local level can tangibly take hold of and do something with. And so linked to that, one question that I'm particularly interested by is, what level of government should you be trying to coordinate, or perhaps rather facilitate or encourage this bottom-up action from?
You have to keep all of the different levels in mind. I mean, you can't just choose between one or the other. The thing about I focus on in a sense the grassroots as you try to change politics as opposed to policy, is that we now have fantastic toolkit that we didn't have even in the last century. At the end of the last century, we didn't have. It's very much a 21st century toolkit that people can organize themselves. I mean, we use social media right now for entertainment. It's about time we started to use it to make civilization possible. And that's that ability. That's just one piece of this giant opera we're trying to construct, which is a world safe with a safe climate in it. And you still need to not just organize people locally to do things locally. You need to get that reflected in the political choices that you make. At a city level, I think cities are going to be increasingly important in doing this, and have much better room to pull people together than national governments do. And you build up that sort of piece, but we have to do it very fast. We've got, maybe 20, 30 years to at least get far enough down the track to preserve the option of, and I mean it without any, the option of keeping civilization together.
Yeah. And maybe on this topic of urgency, because that's really what I took from the IPCC report, the fact that we've got this map from which we should be building this journey, to use the analogy you used earlier. And yet we're not moving fast enough. So what would your words of advice be to different types of individuals wanting to build momentum and accelerate change on climate action?
Get on with it. Don't rely on government. Don't rely especially on the politicians. And if the politicians aren't up for it, get rid of them if you can. That's it. I mean, in some sense, you can overcomplicate it. Now, how that manifests itself is going to be enormously different in different places. The important piece is to construct a kind of narrative around this that unites people rather than divides them. The thing that's very noticeable about the authoritarians, the people who want to stick with the present and not build the future, that they very much succeed by working at dividing people. So I don't think the tone of this is going to be helped by a sort of thing that's a campaign so much against other people or what other people are doing as it is around just getting on with doing what we can do that makes a difference. And it's not, the kind of narrative, the blame narrative is not the most profitable way. I don't mean to say you shouldn't identify real obstacles and try to get rid of them, but I just think the sort of narrative around hope and around building a better future is a stronger narrative in the long run.
Well, that's certainly an empowering message. And ahead of COP26 this year in Glasgow, how hopeful are you that this narrative of hope, of action, of bringing people together for cooperation, that will be the foundation that we're working with there? Is that the feeling within your sphere that we're going into this with?
I'm not very hopeful. I don't think we've got a particular crop of political leaders who can construct or have any real appetite or ability to construct that narrative. And again, I don't much think it matters in some sense whether I'm looking at the democracies who will try harder or the autocracies which won't maybe try at all. But I don't think I'm very hopeful that Glasgow in itself will reflect that. That's why I've got an emphasis in this conversation about building from the bottom up. Now, what matters in Glasgow is that we keep going and we keep going together. So it matters that however limited it is, we reflect the importance that of actually the UNFCCC as a way of keeping at least everybody in the same conversation. And, I set out as an environmentalist to make the world go around differently. And after a while, I kind of worked out that money really did make at least a lot of the world go round. So if I wanted to make the world go round differently, I had to learn how to make the money go round differently. And what made the money go round. And what I learned, what made the money go round was gossip. It was kind of very sophisticated gossip, but it was basically gossip. Or if I put that in politer terms, it's conversation is what makes the world go round at every level, from the very basic family through community and city to nation state and the world. And we've got to keep the people in the same conversation. And that's my aspiration and hope for Glasgow, that we keep people in the same conversation. Because the only way we're going to solve this problem is by having conversations like this one.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think the nice thing really about this idea of conversation being the foundation through which we can drive change is that almost everybody at least has this as a tool in their arsenal. They have the ability to have conversations with others, spark an idea in one place that can then travel to another and inspire others in turn. So yeah.
One of the dangers of environmentalists, and certainly one that lots of politicians suffer from, is thinking that you're the person holding the world up. And somehow if you aren't doing it all on your own with this massive effort, it won't get done. And that's just an illusion. The fact is that actually what I'm saying is only giving voice to feelings that are shared by millions and millions, probably billions of people around the planet. I happen to have had the education and the opportunity to give voice to it, but I don't think what I feel is any different from what most people feel. So, and if I did, why would I bother? Because there are more of them than there are of me. So I'd be wasting my time. I'm not. I think most people, and again, we've seen this through the virus and in Afghanistan, and indeed lots of other places in the world. Most people want to leave and do lead lives where common decency is a dominant feature of those lives. Importance of political leadership is that it actually encourages and fosters that common decency. The problem with bad political leadership is it seeks to divide and destroy. And climate change makes that a total defeat for civilization. We're not going to succeed in climate change unless we can tap into the kind of forces I'm talking about that most people share.
An idea actually that we're looking at a lot this year in terms of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival is the idea of humble leadership and what exactly that looks like. And for me, at least, that's exactly what you're speaking to here. So, taking the ego out of the equation and focusing on raising people up, bringing others together.
I think that's exactly right. But I think what's really important in the context of this particular initiative is you can't do this without bureaucracy, without administration. I would prefer that term. You can't do this without people who are willing to and understand and have the skills of organizing people when conversations get them to want to do something and actually doing that piece of it. It's completely dependent. I am not in favor of a revolution that gets rid of bureaucrats. I do not think anarchy is a very good idea. I think it's a very bad idea. And I think that people who are, there's a whole bunch of sort of anarchic capitalism around now in the sort of crypto coin movement, things like that. and indeed a lot of social media, that is all about freedom to, and doesn't remember that without freedom from, you're never free to do anything.
Well, that's a very powerful and uplifting message. You know, our creative bureaucrats, or as you rightly say, public administrators, are crucial to building a brighter future. And perhaps drawing on that inspiring note as we come to a close now, if you had to pick one takeaway, or a couple if you like, from this conversation for our creative bureaucrat audience, what would that be?
Get on with it. Keep going. Don't give up. Keep acting as a constraint on the sort of wilder impulses that political leaders have, and keep engaging with an ever wider range of people in society in order to better sort of engage them, better work them into the process. We're not going to do this without cooperation dominating over competition. So in some sense, our bureaucrats are the people who build the machinery of cooperation.
Well, I would say that's a very hopeful and inspiring note to finish things on. So, Tom, I just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us. I, at least, have found this really insightful and inspiring, and I really hope our audience has too.
Thank you for asking. Part of it is a lot of these things and things I'm saying are saying because of this conversation. They're not necessarily things I've got in a preordained script. It's what conversation does. It stimulates creativity. Go for it.